decades, China's meteoric economic rise has led it to increasingly look beyond its borders for new growth opportunities. A vital pillar of China's global strategy has been greater engagement with African countries through trade, investment, infrastructure financing, labor migration, and more. This evolving relationship has reshaped economies and politics across the African continent. However, it has also been plagued by controversy and accusations of a new form of colonialism. Chinese youth flee to Africa. An important backdrop to increased Chinese involvement in Africa has been worsening economic conditions within China itself. After decades of rapid growth, China's economy has slowed significantly since 2010. In 2022 and 2023, strict COVID lockdowns and a real estate crisis precipitated further declines. Unemployment has spiked, especially among Chinese youth. This has motivated more young Chinese to look abroad for better opportunities. According to official statistics, China's youth unemployment rate hit 21.3% in June before the government stopped releasing the figure publicly. However, experts estimate the real rate now exceeds 46.5%, an unprecedented level. On platforms like Weibo and Xiao, Africa has become a hot topic among Chinese youth. Social media influencers share stories of finding jobs or launching businesses in Africa. Comments light up with young people asking about opportunities on the continent. This interest is a remarkable shift from the past. Dr. Maria Repnikova, an expert on Chinese migration to Africa, explains that more and more young Chinese are working in Africa, not only in large state-owned enterprises, but also in smaller groups or as individuals seeking entrepreneurial opportunities. For many youth, Africa represents a chance to escape both economic troubles and social pressures at home. Slowing growth over the past decade has challenged Beijing's long-standing hope that economic rise would attract Chinese talent back home. Now faced with a severe crunch, some are willing to venture as far as Africa to find decent jobs. As Professor Joshua Eisenman notes, that youth must go so far afield reflects the very bad economic situation in China. China death trap in Africa. One of the most visible and controversial forms of Chinese engagement with Africa has been financing massive infrastructure projects. Over the past 20 years, China has invested an estimated $300 billion in African transportation networks, energy grids, ports, housing, telecommunications, and more. Most projects are financed by low or zero-interest loans from China's Export-Import Bank and built by Chinese construction firms. Supporters praise this infrastructure financing as providing vital development capital that the West refuses to offer. But Chinese lending in Africa is a deliberate attempt for poor countries to be in debt traps that allow China to seize strategic assets. Analysts say overly generous loan terms are offered for projects with little economic rationale beyond giving China future leverage. When countries inevitably cannot service the debts, China can demand control of ports, railways, mines, and more. For instance, when Sri Lanka struggled to repay loans, China took possession of a strategic port for 99 years in 2017. Some analysts dub this strategy debt colonialism. As Africa's largest bilateral creditor owning over 20% of the continent's debt, China has huge leverage. The pandemic has made repayment ability even worse. In 2020, Nigeria reportedly had to hand over 20% of its entire oil production to China to service outstanding debts. The next year, the Democratic Republic of Congo signed over $6 billion in mineral reserves. Critics warn such deals forfeit African resources, but leaders feel they have no choice to avoid default. Nowhere have seizure fears been greater than in Uganda over its Entebbe airport. China provided loans for airport expansion, sparking concerns it could take control if Uganda defaulted. The Ugandan Civil Aviation Authority had to deny reaching any agreement for China to repossess infrastructure. However, the specter of losing such a strategic asset shows how debt gives China influence. Controversial Chinese labor practices. Accompanying surging Chinese business engagement and infrastructure investment in Africa has been a steady flow of Chinese workers migrating to the continent. Chinese laborers make up the bulk of employees on projects financed by China. Major African infrastructure undertakings can involve thousands of Chinese expatriates sent over to handle construction and management. This pattern has fueled accusations of unfair labor practices by Chinese firms who deny Africans equal employment. Critics say the best jobs go to experienced Chinese workers, while Africans are left with menial low-wage tasks. There are frequent reports of separate eating areas and living quarters for Chinese and African workers. Language barriers, cultural differences, and outright racism all contribute to tensions around the influx of Chinese labor. In 2021, over 200,000 Chinese work permits were issued in Africa, but some experts estimate up to 1 million Chinese migrants are currently working in Africa when accounting for those doing so illegally. The steady arrival of Chinese workers to meet labor needs both within projects and businesses has caused considerable backlash across African societies. People complain the continent's youth miss out on valuable skills and jobs. Host countries have started pushing back by instituting laws mandating that a certain percentage of project staff must be local hires. But Chinese firms have been creative at skirting such requirements. Uganda recently had to cancel a $2.2 billion railway over the chosen consortium's plan to import Chinese laborers. As Sino-African investment booms, managing controversies around labor flows will loom large, turning aid and investment into geopolitical influence. While China touts its development financing and business activities in Africa as win-win cooperation, experts contend this engagement is largely aimed at gathering geopolitical influence. Growing Chinese aid and investment across the continent has enabled Beijing to steadily peel away African nations from recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. Today, only the tiny kingdom of Eswatini maintains full diplomatic ties with Taipei instead of Beijing. Analysts found African countries that maintain relations with Taiwan receive 2.7 fewer Chinese infrastructure projects annually. Conversely, siding firmly with China in UN votes yields 1.8 more Chinese projects per year. Taiwan accuses Beijing of dollar diplomacy, using aid and investment to buy off countries and isolate Taipei diplomatically. Nearly every African ally Taiwan had in the past has abandoned it after taking Chinese money. Beyond Taiwan, China uses infrastructure financing and trade relations as leverage to shape African countries' stances on issues Beijing deems important. African leaders know sticking to positions favored by China keeps Chinese capital flowing into their economies. Those who go against Chinese interests risk losing that support. This financial pressure has progressively aligned most African governments behind China's core geopolitical agenda. Critics worry such heavy reliance on China distorts independent African foreign policies. However, African leaders contend they are pragmatically securing investment, not capitulating sovereignty, but the power asymmetry in the relationship sparks concerns. As one Zambian official stated, "We have to make a choice at times between our friends, the Chinese, and our traditional friends, the Western donors, and there are certain strategic moves that we have to make to get around Western donors' frustrations." China's expanding military engagement, seeking to protect its growing investments and expatriate population in Africa, Beijing has moved to expand security ties and its military footprint on the continent. China established its first permanent overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017, while the United States also maintains a large base nearby. China's arrival as its forces can now project power in Africa and the Middle East. China has also become the second-largest arms supplier to Africa over the past decade. Major recipients of Chinese military aid and weapons include Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, and Sudan. African armies are equipped with Chinese tanks, artillery, small arms, uniforms, and more. In 2021, Beijing spent an estimated $5.6 billion on arms transfers to Africa. Beyond hardware, China provides military training and support to dozens of African militaries. The People's Liberation Army conducts exchanges and joint exercises with African counterparts. China also deploys its navy to the Gulf of Aden for anti-piracy operations, securing strategic maritime choke points like the Suez Canal and Strait of Hormuz depends on stability in Africa. Chinese boots are also increasingly on the ground through participation in UN peacekeeping missions. As of mid-2022, over 2,400 Chinese personnel were serving in blue helmet operations across the continent. Critics allege, however, that China's principal concern is securing access to resources rather than maintaining peace. Debate over a new colonialism? As Chinese engagement with Africa has ballooned, so too have accusations that Beijing is enacting a form of neo-colonialism over the continent. Critics say China is purposefully trapping poor countries' independency through unsustainable debts and importation of Chinese labor. Its extensive influence over African governments through aid and investment amounts to undermining sovereignty. Observers note eerie parallels to European imperialism, where domination was achieved not through direct rule but economic and political control, while China eschews old-style colonial abuses and overt exploitation. Its approach of wielding finance, commerce, and geopolitics to wield power and penetrate societies smacks of revived colonial thinking to critics. Others countercharge colonialism by pointing out the agency of African leaders. Supporters of Chinese involvement stress that African governments willingly and eagerly accept loans, investment, and partnerships with China to advance their countries. Nations like Ethiopia have even crafted China-style development plans aiming to replicate Beijing's state-driven capitalism tailored for African realities. Much hinges on whether African economies can avoid long-term dependence on China. Leaders believe accepting Chinese capital now is the fastest pathway to building self-reliance. But if they fail to do so, the risks of debt traps and lost sovereignty could become severe down the road. Weighing benefits versus hidden costs will define Africa's path ahead. The evolving relationship between China and Africa has taken an ominous turn. What began as mutually beneficial economic engagement has increasingly morphed into blatant exploitation. Behind the facade of development assistance lies a deliberate strategy of debt entrapment and resource plunder. African nations, lured by easy Chinese loans and glittering infrastructure, now find themselves caught in a trap. Unable to repay debts, countries forfeit vital ports, mines, and other strategic assets to Beijing's control. The import of Chinese labor shuts locals out of jobs and skills transfer, and China leverages its patronage to corrode African sovereignty and autonomy in foreign affairs. In essence, Africa has fallen prey to a vicious new form of colonialism. Unlike the overt imperialism of the past, China's approach deploys finance, infrastructure, and geopolitics to indirectly dominate weaker states. But the result is the same: the commandeering of resources, erosion of self-rule, and persistent underdevelopment. As China's footprint enlarges, so too does its appetite. The early warm rhetoric of win-win cooperation has given way to a more transactional and coercive relationship. African leaders, once hopeful of replicating China's rise, have been reduced to a choice between debt default or submission to Beijing's demands. Far from lifting the continent, Chinese partnership now threatens to condemn it to indefinite dependency. Africa thus faces a bleak predicament. In its hour of need, the dragon offered a tempting bargain. But behind the facade of friendship lay a trap that is steadily swallowing the continent's freedom and control over its destiny. The scales have fallen from Africa's eyes too late, and the costs of its naive have yet to fully unfold.